Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to Remember What's Next. Rabbi Ken Spiro, not from Israel.
No, still
Well,
stranded. The lost tribes
technically, we're
of
all
New
from
the
Israel.
lost
Let's be
tribes of
awesome.
New
Yeah.
York.
Yeah, exactly. You are in the Lost Tribe right now, which is
Suburbia.
entirely New York City.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so we are actually going to do, as we just alluded to, we're going to talk today, part two of what we were talking before about crypto Jews. We're going to dig into a bit of this famous moniker, the 10 lost tribes of Israel, and to try to understand what does that mean today? Who are the people in the world who somehow identify with B'nai Israel or the Jewish people? Are they actually part of the Jewish people? What does it mean to be quote unquote lost? Does that mean that we actually don't know where you are, or is it that we don't really know if you're actually Jews or not? I think there's so many different facets to this, both geographically and historically, and also just in this present time around the question, who is a Jew? Certainly in North America or Western society, where there's a lot of people that are saying, as a Jew, and speaking for the Jewish people, and don't necessarily have, the most Jewish thing they've ever done is say, as a Jew. Or how do we sort of start to determine who are we, who fits into that, who's part of the people? Don't we just want more Jews? Wouldn't that be a good thing? And how do we find our people, or how do they find us? And what does that look like in the daily in Israel today? Because that's definitely where that question has been rather gnarly to deal with, both politically and spiritually, and just on a humanitarian, compassionate basis. How do we bring people in?
Right.
So,
So you're
where do we start with this?
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's really important to what you mentioned a lot of stuff now to unpack it a little bit. Just to define a few terms. First of all, we talk about, who's a Jew. We have the traditional halachic definition, Jewish law definition of someone whose mother is Jewish. Judaism is not patrilineal, it's matrilineal descent. It goes back to a spiritual point about not because you always know who the mother is versus the father, but rather because on a spiritual metaphysical level, the woman contributes, in terms of soul genetics, the internalness, the pnimiut, in Hebrew, as we say, of who you are internally, comes from the mother. So that goes back from time immemorial in Jewish identity. And then we have, for instance, the state of Israel uses the law of return is actually based on um, the German racial laws, the Nuremberg laws, of people who, remember, a lot of Jews in Germany prior to the Holocaust were intermarried and not halakhically Jewish anymore, meaning daddy was Jewish, mommy was not. So they may have had really Jewish names like, Goldberg and Cohen, but they actually weren't. But Hitler still had different degrees of defining people racially, from pure Jew to half Jew. The term was Mischling. And these people were all persecuted to varying degrees. So the state of Israel and its foundation, which was right after the Holocaust, basically, said if you're being persecuted as someone who's Jewish, we should save you. Now, saving means, well, we might let you come to the land of Israel, but that doesn't necessarily make you Jewish halachically, which has big implications throughout the history, primarily with the large influx of Jews from the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had a massive rate of intermarriage and assimilation, but people wanted to get out of there. But it even spills over into issues like the origins of the Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jewish community. So that's one very interesting topic, which causes some level of problems within Israel, especially for people who are part Jewish in Russia, may not have been halachically in the former Soviet Union, who were being persecuted for being part Jewish, just as Jews in Germany were, and then coming to Israel and being recognized as Israeli citizens, but not being recognized as Jews. So that's one complicated aspect there, which we need to talk about. But the other thing is, in terms of defining our terms, we have the idea of the lost tribes of Israel, which we definitely have to touch on. And if we go chronologically, we go back to the earliest uh, period of time when you had massive exodus from Israel and Jews getting scattered around the world, which predates the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem 2,500 years ago, to a period of time that's almost 2,700 years, like 130 years earlier, when the northern kingdom of what is called Israel, because after the death of King Solomon, Israel was split into two countries: Israel in the north, uh, and Judah in the south. The kings of Judah are the descendants of King David, and the kings of Israel are various people who have no connection to King David. And those people, during a period of time, if you look in the book of Kings, over a period of about 18 years, this is during that what's called divided monarchy period. The world power of Assyria to the north of Israel, which is today in the area of Iraq, will be the hegemony state of the Middle East, and Israel in the north and Judah in the south will be vassal states of that kingdom. They will, over a period of 18 years, basically chop up the northern kingdom bit by bit and exile. It's like kind of first California and Texas went, and then the Midwest, and finally New York and the East Coast. To give an American analogy, that's what happens. So 130 years before the destruction of Judah in the south by the Babylonians, the Assyrian Empire, which is the world power before the Babylonian Empire, will exile the majority of the Jewish people. And if you look in the book of Kings in chapter 17, I believe it is Second Kings, it talks about Chalor and Chabor and the Gozan River, um, which are places, some of which we know where they are, but it's basically the area of Syria and to the east and north, Turkey and into Afghanistan and who knows. So that is the oldest group of people who have like a connection, more or less, to the ancient Hebrews of the Bible. And then we have another group, which we talked about a lot in our last part one of this, which is going back only a mere like 500 years, largely a byproduct of the expulsion of Jews from Spain, and those Jews fleeing, either staying in Spain and secretly practicing Judaism. We talked about those, the Morano, the conversos, in Hebrew, the Bnei Anusim, those who are forced, and also the various places where these Jews went. We talked a lot about South and Central America and the Caribbean, which is after Christopher Columbus. So and there's other communities there we should talk about because they're in Goa in India, in Sicily. There's some really interesting places that people might not know about, which we should mention. And the third interesting group are these just communities that have appeared, a lot of them relatively recently, who claim to be connected to the Jewish people, like the Lemba in Africa, the Black Hebrews. You have a whole group in northern India that are more related to people in the Himalaya region who are called the B'nai Menashe, and those groups of people whose connection to Judaism is definitely a little more tenuous, and some of which only appears relatively recently in history. So you have all these different people floating around, some of whom are
and
clearly
and and
descended.
just to say tenuous, but also like weirdly, like you
Yeah,
can't refute the fact that they're actually practicing huge swaths of Jewish practice, sometimes more than like Jessica from Miami Beaches, who, can trace her Jewish lineage all the way back. Like, I think it's just an interesting,
yeah, yeah. They
that
want to
they're
be.
living a dedicated, potentially halachic life, but, their halachic Jewishness is in question. So it's really complicated to try to figure out what to do. Like, these are people who really want to be Jewish. Like,
Right, right. And
um,
they want to come back, and a lot of it's been a big struggle for many of them to be accepted. And then what does it mean practically? A lot of them have to go through a conversion in any case because there's no clear origins. Uh, and again, a lot of these interesting communities do have some genetic signature that indicates that, at least on a certain level, a certain percentage, they're Middle Eastern, even if they're living in far-flung places like in Africa or in India. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are originally from the Jewish people. So between the myth And if you just Google this, if you go online, you look in Wikipedia and you look at 10 lost tribes, you start throwing out different names, the B'nai Israel and the B'nai Menashe. And there's one other group, like the Samaritans in northern Israel. There's like 900 of these people who are, people know the Samaritans from the Good Samaritans of the Christian Bible, who weren't so good according to Jewish tradition. So it is such a mishmash. But when you put it all together, Ellie, we end up with millions upon millions, far more people. I'm not talking about the ones who may very well be Jewish, like the who are Jewish descent, who no longer identify nor want to be identified with, whether we're talking about the 20% at least of people in Spain who have Jewish ancestry, possibly the Pashtun who are like 75, 90 million of them in Afghanistan, whatever they are, this huge tribe, which could also be, but no longer identified in any way as being Jewish. So we really end up with a lot of people floating around the world who on some level might
Right.
be Jewish, genetically partially Jewish, identify with wanting to be Jewish. It's very
Amazing.
complicated.
I think also one of the things that strikes me when you speak about even the beginnings of the idea of a lost tribe is we cannot fathom today, especially those of us who live in cities, where most of the masses of people that you're surrounded by are just nameless, faceless people who
Mhm.
you don't interact with and don't really know so well. So even the analogy to say, like, just imagine like half of your city, God forbid, disappeared. Most people would be like, I don't know them anyways. Doesn't matter to me. You know what I mean? I don't have a relationship with them, whatever. There'd just be less traffic, like not a big deal. But I think if we think about the time in the world where the only relationships that you had were direct relationships with people because your existential survival depended
Yeah.
on being in relationship with those around you. That's why exile was the worst possible punishment because you don't survive alone. And so this experience where a huge chunk of us both being dispersed from our land, where literally it's as if it's not just that it's all these different people. It's literally like your family who you rely upon in order to be able to live, to grow, to marry, to build, to have your life have purpose, meaning, and also just functionality to be able to live. Now those people are gone. And I don't think we are able to relate to that anymore because we're just so used to having so many people around that don't really, in our own minds, technically matter to whether or not like we're okay or not. Like we're so like surrounded by constant people in connection, but ultimately very isolated and lonely. So I just want to throw in the emotional piece of it, which is when we speak about the 10 lost tribes, there is also like, oh my gosh, like our family is missing. Where did they go? This like huge loss of connection with the different ways and the different peoples. I guess maybe the closest would be the Shoah, when 2/3 of the world's yeshivas were wiped out, like a huge chunk. And this idea of being the people that live afterwards, where your entire family is gone. So, this happened so long ago, this idea of the 10 lost tribes, but that we still talk about it is like, yeah, there are whole swaths of our family that we have no idea where they are, what happened to them, and that even matters is a uniquely weird question, I think, in modernity, where we're like, yeah, whatever. No one knows who their great great grandparents were, anyways. So why would
Right.
I care about that far back? So I think that's one of the questions for me is like, why does it matter?
Yeah, well, I mean, in general, you're bringing up a very interesting point. The loss of community, the scattering of people, the fact that literally not just the Jewish people, but people who were born, lived, and died for centuries within a very close area to where their great, great, great grandparents lived. So you were that community thing, which you still get. You go to rural America where everyone knows everyone, and there's a lot of, like people are related, cousins, stuff like that is something you don't really have. You can live in an apartment building today and literally not know people on your floor. I've done that myself. So yeah, there's a lot of, and now with smartphones, you could just live on your screen. So there is,
100%.
yes, we don't get that point. But you look at the Jewish people historically, because we have not only lost so many of the Jewish people, we've lost our homeland and had to redevelop our identity outside of our homeland, which is a quite unique experience. And we've tend to develop our own kind of insular community, like sub communities that are geographically different location, but also I wouldn't say ethnically, but there's a certain ethnicity that's unique to different Jewish communities that we've talked about before. Ashkenazim and Sephardim, things like that, comes from isolation and inbreeding, especially amongst Ashkenazim. That those are the people we look at as the Jews. In Israel, you get this much less. Israel is reconstituting a very ancient people. I always say it's the newest old state. The people are back and we have intermingling, and I have like my own children. Three of the five of my kids are all married people who are either, like totally like Yemenite, Egyptian, Moroccan. So we've kind of mixed up the gene pool again, but you have very growing up in America as a non-observant Jew, knowing nothing about Jewish history. I just thought all Jews were a bunch of like white people from Poland kind of thing. And that was my sub community living here in Muncie
Which
and
is
Wesley Hills.
every internet troll's comment on every Jewish thing, which is, go go back to Poland, which is like
Yeah.
hilarious because
The
ask
vast,
anybody in Poland and they'd be like, go back to Israel. We don't want you here even now. So
right,
it's a
right.
really funny like but it's true or what some in the Jewish community would call Ashka normative, right? That we totally ignore the fact that actually we're all MENA Jews from the Middle East, and really only by virtue of being kicked out and having to survive in these different places do we get Sephardim and Ashkenazi. We're all just the same. We're just B'nai Yisrael, basically.
Right, right,
Um,
right.
okay, so where do we start when we start looking into the world in terms of some of these lost tribes? How do we start to find some of the people we feel we've lost?
Right. So, I mean, if anyone's interested in the Lost Tribe thing, the expert on this is a man by the name of Tudor Parfit. He's British. With a name like Tudor Parfit, he better be British. And he's written any number of books on the topic, and he's been fascinated. He's not Jewish, but he's fascinated by the subject of discovering lost Jews. So he's like this adventurous guy who runs around the world doing this. There are other people who, Michael Freund does this today. I know several people in Israel who go around trying to, in the case of these guys in Israel, they're trying to like gather the lost Jews, lost tribes, bring them back home. Um, but just in terms of dealing with this issue of and we talked about previously of the earliest Jewish diaspora, which predates the destruction of the first temple, is again the exile of the Northern Kingdom, which takes place over a period of almost 2 decades. And with those Jews, bottom line, there's much speculation, but they're pretty much lost. I mean, as far as I know, the Pashtun, that claim has
Mm.
not been genetically borne out. There is some weak genetic connection. They have a number of things. Their names, their some of their customs seem to be based on Judaism. But you can't prove anything from that. So, I mean, without going to a
But
massive,
since
yeah.
when do we use genetics to prove that?
Well, we're
Meaning,
not
like, that's
even
not what we go when people get married or divorced or, whatever. Like, we don't send them for genetic tests. We send
yeah.
them for who's your mother, who was your mother's mother, where were they buried, where did they come from? Like, there is no genetically testing whether someone's
Yeah,
a
no,
Jew
we're
or
not
not.
talking about halachic definition and marriage and Jewish law, which absolutely goes on certain criteria of you have to prove certain things like
Right.
but the genetics is only interesting scientifically to answer the question of where did all the Jews go. So since we
Mm.
understand that about almost 2,700 years ago, the majority of the Jews of that were initially the entire Jewish people who had been subdivided into two kingdoms have more or less disappeared. Um, we know that, by the way, after the destruction, that a significant number fled south into Judah, the southern kingdom, which will survive 130 years longer. There are mentions of them in like the Book of Chronicles. Some Jews remained in the northern part of Israel even after the majority were exiled. So today we would say amongst what we call Jews, which get their name from Judah, which is that southern kingdom, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who is a Jew is from the tribe of Judah. Most Jews today have no idea what tribe they're from. If you're a Cohen or a Levi, Levites are a tribe from Jacob's son Levi, and Kohanim are a subgroup that are descended from Moses' brother Aaron. So there you have a Masorah, you have a tradition, but the term Jew, Judah, is kind of generically used to describe all Jews. So we could say first and foremost that amongst the Jewish people of today, there is definitely a mishmash of Jews from all the tribes. But we could also say, I don't think it's just genetically provable, but it's generally assumed that the majority of Jews in the world today are descended from Judah. But on the other hand, there are communities that claim to be living outside the land of Israel, possibly before the destruction of the second temple, the first temple, that are not from the 10 lost tribes. Like there's a Yemenite claim about that they, fearing the Jeremiah's prophecy of destruction, they flee. Now, can you prove that? No. But it could be that there are actually some groups of Jews whose origins even predate the destruction of Judah and that diaspora experience. But that group of Jews gone. There's interesting people throughout history who have traveled around. There's a guy by the name of David Ruveni, really interesting character. You can Google him also, who's around right around the age of exploration, 15th, early 16th century, who like appears in Europe claiming to represent, the armies of the lost, trying to make political alliances like the King of Portugal and things. And he's going to bring this Jewish army in because the story goes about the lost tribes that they're living on the other side of the Sambaton River, which is this mythical river which flows with gravel 6 days a week in one direction, and on Shabbat it goes the other way, and you can't cross it. And they're there, and the return of the 10 lost tribes is always associated with redemption, just as the ingathering of the exiles, a process which we're living through now with the rebirth of the state of Israel and the dramatic growth of its population. So the end of that process is all the lost Jews will come home. So since that is the single largest group of lost Jews, representing the majority of the Jewish population of biblical Israel, the idea that they're going to come back. And then you have these exotic people like Ruveni who are claiming that he's interacted, he represents them. And you get the whole class just on this guy. You have people like Benjamin of Tudela, who lived in the 12th century. So he's concurrent with people like Maimonides, who traveled around the world 100 years before Marco Polo and went out to the East. And he actually visited some of the actual real diaspora, groups of Jews who were scattered around the world going out to the Far East. But the mythology aside, that group of people is gone. We did the literal river Sambaton is a book called On the Other Side of the Sambaton River, dealing with this. So this is the mythology. So again, within the mythology is a kernel of truth, but I guess when the Messiah comes, maybe we'll have the ability to discern who is of Jewish ancestry, and who can come back. But that group is basically gone. So we have to assume that those people are more or less lost to us. But we also, again, have other groups. We talked a lot about South and Central America, the more contemporary. Remember, contemporary Jewish history is a lot older than we think. We talked about the traumatic incident of the last podcast of the between the 14th and 15th centuries of what happened in Spain, in Castile, and then with the expulsion in 1492 of what was the largest Jewish community in the world being overnight destroyed. Forced conversion to Christianity or expulsion, and a lot of those Jews fled to the Ottoman Turkish Empire, the Sephardim as they're called, which means Spain. And a lot of those Jews fled. We talked about to South and Central America, to places like Jamaica, which was given to Christopher Columbus, payoff from the King and Queen of Spain, and then which the British took in the mid 17th century and was used as a launching base for Jewish pirates of the Caribbean. You can read the book by Edward Kritzler, I think his name is. It's a great book about the how the Caribbean, when the British took over parts of it, they were raiding the Spanish and Portuguese shipping. So you have again Jewish
That's
community.
where we actually get the black hats from, by the way, just saying.
That's funny. That's very interesting. There was a guy like a pirate named who was a who was like a rabbi pirate, Moses Cohen Henriquez. So he was like a privateer, and he's one of these guys operating out of his ship was named the Queen Esther, I believe. And he was like, so you have those communities who are some of those communities will remain crypto-Jewish until today, like we mentioned. In the Southwest United States, there's large numbers of people who are of descent in the northern part of South America, in Colombia and Venezuela, and those places in Central America have those communities. There are communities of Jews who once the British took over or the Dutch took over, places like Curacao, which was a Dutch colony off the coast of Venezuela, that are that we these are crypto Jews who or Jews who fled to the New World and returned to openly practicing Judaism because the Dutch and the British were more tolerant of that. This is all in the 17th century. So these are not crypto Jewish communities, but today those communities are either shrinking to almost nothing or non-existent. I would say one of the oldest synagogues in the Western Hemisphere is in Curacao. The original building is gone, but that was one of the first, and in Kingston, Jamaica also. Um, so these are communities which basically shrunk and have more or less disappeared and may have small remnants of Jews still living in them, but they're not crypto-Jewish. They just openly they survive. But then you go to places that are more exotic, like Goa, India. We know that in 1493, Pope Alexander the 11th, this is right after Columbus. He basically divided the Catholic Church, the entire unexplored world, into Spanish and Portuguese areas, with the Portuguese along a longitudinal line. So that's why the Spanish ended up with so much of the New World in the Western Hemisphere. The Portuguese got other interesting things. They're
Isn't
the
that partly the story of Shogun? If you've ever seen
Yeah,
Shogun,
Shogun
it's
is
where the Portuguese have Japan and they've told Japan that there isn't anyone else to deal with. It's like
yeah,
a really fascinating
that
story.
is exactly the story. And also India, Goa, India, on the coast of India. Their Jews fled to Goa, India, and the Inquisition will follow them to these places. We talked about the Inquisition into the 19th century in Mexico. They're still chasing down crypto Jews, the new Hebrews who are secretly trying to reconvert back to Judaism or they're accused of heresy, whatever. So in Goa, you also have uh, in at the same period of time, Jews who are being burned at the stake as heretics and having to secretly practice Judaism. In Sicily also, Sicily is going to be is going to be controlled all the way through the 17th century by the Spanish until eventually it ends up back in Italian hands. And you have
And
crypto
so, how
Jews.
many of these are actually considered possibly lost tribes? And how many of them are just simply Jews that are moving from place to place to place as we are kicked out or pogromed out of wherever we are?
So these groups of people, like in like Sicily, um, are no longer Jewish, but they have Jewish ancestry. There's a Jewish community that in Sicily that goes back a very long time, way before the Spanish. It's the Mediterranean. It's not that far from Israel, but these are not lost tribes in the sense of the story from the Book of Kings. But these are these formerly, crypto Jewish communities like we have in Southwest United States and South and Central America that have Jewish ancestry but no longer identify as such. But I'm saying it's not just in South and Central America. You have these Jews. You find them in all kinds of interesting places scattered around the world from the expulsion of Jews from Spain. But then you also have we're dealing with Spain and Christian world. We also have Islamic persecution of Jews. You have it in North Africa. There are tribes. Jews have been living in North Africa since arguably maybe the First Temple period, but certainly in the Roman Empire, possibly in Carthage, which, the Punic War is going back hundreds of years before the Common Era when the Romans are fighting the Carthaginians. Um, but so the Jewish community in North Africa is thousands of years old. There are tribes that evolved there that were interacting with the indigenous Berber tribes. There's crypto-Jewish communities there also that they believe have Jewish ancestral connection. Um, but more recently, you can go to Mashhad, which is the second largest city in Iran, which, the Persian Jewish community is ancient. It goes all the way back to, first of all, could part of it goes back to probably the 10 lost tribes, but the majority goes back to the destruction of the second temple, first temple, excuse me, going back 2,500 years ago when the Judah falls, the first temple is destroyed, and those Jews are exiled to the Babylonian Empire, which is today Iraq and Persia of today, the Tigris and Euphrates area. And that community survives all the way until the mid 20th century when with the birth of Israel and the 48 War and the 67 Six-Day War, all the Jews in the Middle East are pretty much ethnically cleansed from that area. But um, if we go back to 1839, the Jews of Mashhad are undergo forced conversion. There's anti-Jewish riots in Mashhad, and it's called like the Allah Habdad or something like that. I remember the Arabic expression for, but they're speaking Persian. But
Where is Mashhad?
Mashhad is I think like it's north. I'm not great on my Iranian geography. It's hundreds and hundreds of miles away from, like 900 miles away from Tehran, but I think it's the second largest city in Iran of today. And the Jews are forcibly, some flee, a lot of them flee, but a lot of them are forcibly converted. Mashhadi Jews. A bunch of women, I think 7 or 8 girls, were seized during the riots and forcibly married to Muslims. Dozens of Jews were killed. It's like a mini pogrom, and the remaining Jewish families will openly, a similar thing to Spain, will convert to Islam to save their lives, and then connect their houses underground through tunnels, and like secretly practice Judaism like the Jews of Spain did after 1492, like the Bnei Anusim. And then,
It's on the border of Afghanistan and
yeah,
Turkmenistan.
okay,
That's
so
where it
it's
is. So it's
far out there.
northeast Iran.
Right, that's where I thought it was. I think it's about 900 miles away from Tehran, something like that. But it's interesting today, if you interact with Persian Jews, Iranian Jews, Persians as we call them, they speak Farsi. Um, they're very into their cities. They're Esfahani, Shirazi, Tehrani. But you talk about Mashhadi, and they all like shake the Mashhadi. They're so religious because these were people who, in the very difficult circumstances, were maintained their Jewish identity. They tend to be very today. A lot of them fled to places like America. You go to Great Neck, Long Island. There's a Mashhadi community there. They have certain names. I know a lot of Mashhadi Jews. They tend to be very inbred because they were a very small community that married within. A friend of mine who lives in Israel, she's Mashhadi, and she said that her like grandmother was engaged at a very young age, living in like to like 11, 12 years old, already engaged. They would make sure that they engaged the girls very young age to Jewish guys, even though they didn't like consummate the marriage till later, even later, like 9 years old, to ensure that the Muslims wouldn't steal them. It's a kind of a way,
Right.
just as a lot of the crypto Jews who are escaping the persecution of the Spanish
Mm,
Inquisition
mm,
um, would keep their own separate communities and interbreed within themselves to maintain their crypto Jewish identity. You had the same thing
mm.
happen in the Mashhadi Jews of today. So they're known
Yeah,
to
it's
be very,
interesting to think about that, like as a protection. We always, of course, think of child brides as a horrific abuse. But here it's interesting to say, oh, it's not like they were consummating the marriage or setting up house. It was like a legal thing to do. Oh, this person is married and therefore she can't be stolen in the same way that a single woman would be, or whatever. Like it's a really different context to think about what was the purpose of doing that. Um, because look, normative Judaism doesn't practice that, and we don't advocate for that at all. In fact, we advocate against it. So it's really interesting to see. It shows a lot about what they were enduring as a community, where they had to protect their girls by marrying them off.
Right,
That was the only way to keep them safe from being, raped, killed, enslaved, taken, and disappearing into the Muslim world. So
right.
it's really it's an interesting perspective to understand why certain cultural pieces evolved the way that they did.
Yeah, exactly. And in general, we're dealing with all of these crypto-Jewish communities, be they from Spain or be they from Islamic persecution. Um, the story is basically if somehow the situation externally changed to allow them to openly practice while they still maintain their connection, a lot of them would return. That tended, either they were able to maintain for a long time. In Mashhad, by the way, it wasn't until the Pahlevis, in talking about the beginning of the 20th century, the previous Shah was from that dynastic line, um, allowed them to openly practice Judaism again. But they survived for, about almost a century that way. Generally speaking, you can't do that for that long. It becomes very hard to do. So you have these communities like in South and Central America and places that have interesting things they do that seem to be based on Jewish tradition, but they now are raised, they identify as Christian, versus the communities that were able to escape that persecution, whether it was going to New Amsterdam, which became New York, or going to a place like Curacao, or to Holland itself, which was a Spanish colony until they broke away in a very long, protracted war against Spain in the 16th century, in the 1500s, and emerged as a separate, independent country. And then Jews could openly practice. So what you end up with is the people who came back um, and were openly practiced, and those we've lost who are probably a much greater number. The term, by the way, you meet. I know some Syrian Jews who have the name Satan or Sitan, which is an interesting name. It sounds like Sutton, it sounds like Scottish or something, but it's short for Sfardi Tahor, which
Wow.
was Samechtet, because when Jews were expelled from Spain, there's some people who gave up everything, they lost everything because they wanted to preserve their Judaism, and there's
Mm.
Jews who, not judging them, but who stayed and converted, and the ones who gave up everything, they had like a kind of it's like we're like the pure guys. We're the ones who took the pain to stay
Mhm.
Jewish. We don't want to be confused with those guys who chickened out and you
Right.
know. So you have the people who came back and started practicing again. So again, the majority of those people are lost to us. Um, but you have other examples, like for instance, in the Soviet Union. This is not crypto-Jewish in the sense that there was forced conversion, because in the Russian Revolution of 1917 was a communist revolution, largely led by Jews, sadly. Um, but it was anti-religious. So there was persecution of religion, and especially, although Lenin himself was not anti-Semitic, under Stalin there was massive persecution of Jews.
Right.
And it's a unique circumstance where you have people who are um, it's the only place I could think of where you had Jews undergoing a lot of persecution, but assimilating. Generally, what
Mhm.
keeps Jews Jewish is Jews being persecuted. Being loved to death by non-Jews has proved to be far more fatal. You put Jews in prosperity and wealth, like in America, and among non-Orthodox Jews, you get intermarriage rate of 71%.
Well, it also
Um,
sounds like, partly what was happening in the Soviet Union was as long as you hide your Judaism, you can be just as miserable as everyone else. Like you can just like live your life and life just kind of sucks in general for everybody.
but
So you can have that too, as long as you pretend that you're not Jewish or don't talk, don't ask, don't tell, kind of a situation.
But in Russia, they have on your identity card, when I was a student there many years ago, they would put Jewish. You're part Jewish. If his dad Jewish and his mom is not. So
Mhm.
you have a unique, but they totally destroyed the Torah infrastructure and the religious infrastructure of Russia,
Right.
especially for Jews. So you had several generations of Jews who were raised with no Jewish education whatsoever, no connection. So, and a lot of them married out, which is why
and a
of the,
great and a great fear of anything like that,
yeah,
right? Jewish education, rabbis,
it was
religion, like
dangerous. It was
just
dangerous.
a deep and abiding present fear of anything to do with being outwardly practicing Judaism.
Right. So it's kind of like a similar but different situation in which you had very few Jews survived Soviet Union religious. I even met one guy whose name was Subota. He was a guy who stayed, a Chabad guy who used to live in Beit Vagan, who managed to be in a Siberian labor camp and never violate Shabbat. That was very rare. So there you have the destruction, the spiritual
Mm.
destruction, and even physical destruction of a large community, more contemporaneously, but also the Holocaust itself. A lot of Jews were hidden. People were hiding. They were like babies were given to families or sent to orphanages or monasteries, and after the war, the parents were often dead, and the kids were now orphaned and being raised as Christians. There's some very interesting stories, but Yitzhak Halevi Herzog, the chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Herzog, and Yosef Shlomo Kahaneman, and also Rabbi Eliezer Silver, American rabbi, who after the war went back to these different communities in Eastern Europe and to try and find these Jewish children who had, some of them had probably little or no consciousness of their identity, going into churches on Sunday and yelling out Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. That's the first thing a Jewish child learns, is that, and to see if any of the kids responded. Like, did they look? Something triggered their memory that they
Mm.
were, because a lot of these, there's a woman named name of Irina Sendler, who was a Polish, very righteous Polish young woman who worked as a social worker and a nurse in the Warsaw Ghetto, who, amazing story, who smuggled out something like 2,500 Jewish babies from that ghetto and placed them in Gentile homes around Warsaw, and even wrote their names down and kept them secretly hidden so she could reconnect them after the war. In most cases, it didn't happen. So you have, again, these are crypto Jews, so to speak. There's people floating around. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had a little mini resurgence in places like Poland of people coming out of the woodwork who were
I think
part
it
Jews
speaks,
or,
it also just speaks so interestingly to what I was saying in the beginning, which is most people don't know who their great great grandparents were. They can't say back who the line of people that they come from, which in a way is such a huge loss, because how many people are out there that have no idea who they are and what they're connected to, and that they would find, oh wow, I'm actually Jewish, or I'm connected to this, or I'm connected to that. I mean, everybody has, like, dreams and wishes of being, oh, suddenly you find out you're royalty from some weird country. But really, the loss is a deep sense of disconnect from any kind of people or peoplehood. That's why that show where the guy takes celebrities and does their family tree is always so revelatory, and how many of them end up finding out that they're Jewish in some way, or that they're connected to Judaism. Like, if everybody did that, if everybody took the time to kind of trace themselves back, even 4 generations, never mind 7, like the Ethiopians have to do. But like, you would, I think, really find some interesting things that you're connected to. But how many people don't do that? So I think there are just so many lost parts of the Jewish people out there who have
right.
no clue, and then they don't even know what it means when they find out.
Right, right. I mean, unfortunately, we're starting to get that in. Yeah, people who are raised in America, I believe half Jews are not even raised with any affiliation to any synagogue. I'm not talking about Reform, Greek Construct, nothing. So they're also kind of lost souls in their own way. But you add it up over a period of millennia, and you're piling on more and more examples. And again, the longer they're gone, the less likely they are to be found, unless through
Mm.
supernatural means, like again. We have the Mashiach, Messiah comes and he has his spiritual, you know, he can locate
MRI.
people. But the other thing that's really interesting is, like, I want to touch on in this is those communities that don't really, the lost tribes of Israel. We know they're gone. Where they are, we're not sure, but but we know their origins go back to the crypto Jewish communities later in history, be they from Spain and Portugal, or from Islamic persecution. We know where these are communities that we know existed, that their origins are legitimately connected to the Jews, but they're gone. But then there's these other communities that just out of nowhere claim to be part of the Jewish people. I mean, one of them is not out of nowhere, but the Ethiopian community, Bate Israel, that's a very interesting discussion. Um, this is a community of people who look very much like the indigenous people of Ethiopia, who have interesting traditions about where they come from. One of them is the story about King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, that she comes to check out Solomon's wisdom, and they have like a little something happens there. Well, he already had a lot of wives and concubines, so what's one more?
Hmm.
And out
Hmm.
of that will come, I mean, all the legends aside, the discussion about Ethiopian Jewry goes back a very long way in rabbinic thinking of do we, because that's the issue, especially with the reconstitution of the Jewish state, where now people want to come back to Israel. And it became a big issue with all the airlifts that were done, especially in the 1980s,
Right.
of taking within that community. By the way, there was a sub community called the Falashmura. The derogatory term for them is Falasha. They don't call themselves that. The Bati Israel or the Ethiopian Jewish community. There's another community because even though they identify as being Jewish for a very long period of time, a good chunk of that community also underwent conversion to Christianity. And with the ingathering of the exiles, a lot of them have wanted now to convert back. They're in Ethiopia and wanted to convert back. And will they be accepted? Is it family reunification? But even
Hmm.
within that part of the community that stayed always Jewish and did not convert out, there's big debates. On a genetic level, for instance, again, it doesn't qualify you as being Jewish. While there is a percentage of Jewish ancestry found within, and Middle Eastern ancestry found within Ethiopian Jewry, their genetic makeup is uh, very closely related to the indigenous population of Ethiopia. They seem to be, that's their origins overwhelmingly. But as I
Hmm.
said previously, Ashkenazi Jewish men are between 45 and 75% Italian. But the difference is, and this is very important because people say, what's the difference between Russian Jews and Ethiopians? It's racism because the Russian Jews are white Ashkenazim primarily, although not exclusively, and the Ethiopians are black. No, it's nothing to do with that. It has to do with the origins of the community. We're not sure uh, where they came from, their origins. They have all kinds of legends and traditions.
I think one of the things they say is they're connected to either the tribe of Dan
Yeah,
or
that's another.
they'll like part of their lore and lineage, and then some are connected to. I think it's the Rastafarian story. Is the Queen of Sheba who Haile Selassie said that he came from the Queen, is connected to the line of the Queen of Sheba, and that's where Rastafarianism comes from, which is Bob
Right, right,
Marley. But different like lineages. But it seems I remember hearing that the Ethiopians say that they were connected to the tribe of Dan and that they disappeared before the loss of the temple and were therefore keeping Jewish law without rabbinic Judaism because they weren't around at the time that the Sanhedrin was created. So I think that was some of what I had heard when I
right.
was in Israel speaking to people in that community.
Right. So again, it's we what is claimed and what can be proven is the great question in all of these groups. But
Right.
the Ethiopians, who are a very significant group, a very large population, who have been identified as Jews for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, known by the outside world going back centuries, is a
Mm-hmm.
much bigger issue, especially since tens of thousands of them have moved to Israel. Um, but again, their Torah scroll was written in Gez, which is Ethiopian Coptic Christian language. They don't have the oral law. They didn't have certain Jewish holidays. So when it came time for them, and a lot of them struggled very hard to make it to the land of Israel, it was very difficult. Many of them died trying to walk,
Right.
through to Israel. I always tell this great story. There's a woman I know who runs the Ethiopian Jewish Cultural Center in Tel Aviv. She's a character. She's hysterical. I brought groups there. Her name is Ashaga, and she was born like in the desert when the parents were fleeing. They're really trying to get there. And
Well, isn't there a movie like the Red Sea Hotel, or I think it is, because the Mossad was very involved in an airlift operation to get Ethiopians to Israel safely. Like they airlifted a bunch of them
I don't know,
there.
I'm not sure that I don't, funny, I remember seeing that. I remember it was about Ethiopian Jewry or about other Sephardic Jews trying to get, I don't remember the story behind that. But yeah, there was several airlifts actually done. We're given permission to bring them out. But Ashaga is hysterical. Her English is really, really funny. And this is a community that thought they were the only Jews left. Origins aside, and
Yeah, it
and
was called,
and
sorry, it was called the Red Sea
diving.
Diving
Yeah, they set up
Resort.
this.
And they set up this resort that was a front for the Israeli, for the Mossad to rescue thousands of Ethiopian
It
Jews from
was.
the Sudan.
Okay. So yeah, it was very great. The Mossad is great. They do great pagers and freight
Incredible.
companies, and you name it, they do it. They're
And
the
it became
best.
like a super successful resort. They didn't even want to run it. They kept getting people booking in, and they're like, "We don't want to do this. We just want to get these people out of here." It's a
Yeah, like I
really
say, our
incredible
our
film.
failures are humanity's success stories. But but it's funny. So she talks about her experience, like being born in like some desert somewhere in a very difficult, dangerous journey. And uh, and she asked her grandmother when they were in Israel, because she's raised in Israel her whole life, what was the biggest surprise when you came to Israel? And the grandmother says, white Jews, which I found
Right?
hysterically funny because they thought they were. By the way, today, all the issues aside, when they started bringing them en masse, because there is a question of their origins, nothing to do with them being dark skinned. I have a Yemenite son-in-law who is very dark. He's yeah, but it's not a skin color issue. So they have to go through a what is called a token conversion,
Right.
which is you don't have to make them
Which,
study,
by
you
the
don't test
way,
them.
many
Yeah.
of the Russians did also. That's why that's partly how you know it's not just skin color. There's a lot of Russians that also had to go through major conversions and
Oh, they had to go through
um,
proper conversion because they were actually not. They were persecuted for being Jewish, but daddy was Jewish, mommy wasn't. They had to actually go through a conversion
right,
process, which
right,
they'd expedite because they're already living in Israel. All these things are very complicated and politicized. But that is the biggest community but then you have communities like the B'nai Menashe who live we talked about at the beginning, they're living in northern India. They're closer to the area of right near Tibet and things like that. They ethnically don't look like the Indians we think of in India today. Um, and they just start appearing relatively recently in the 20th century, less than 100 years ago, claiming that the tribe of Menashe. Okay, they did genetic studies on them. There is some Middle Eastern origins to them, but that proves nothing because there's so much trade routes running through that part of the world, that a lot of these communities that might try and pull their origins out of stories in the Bible, like lost tribes, Menashe, Dan, things like that. Those stories might not be true, but there could well be that there's a real Jewish connection there. Like it may well be that the Ethiopian community, we can't prove this, but it could be originate in Jews who are like Yemenite Jews or something like that, someone in a nearby community that moved into that area and had an impact on the indigenous population who started to convert, and they built a population which is genetically overwhelmingly not Jewish, but has its origins in some core of Jews who, whether they're Radhanite traders going out to the Far East and stopped along the Silk Road at various places, getting all the way out to places like Kaifeng in China that we mentioned previously, or different communities in India, like the B'nai Menashe. So B'nai Menashe, for instance, and I know the rabbi of that community, Shimon Ganti, who studied Nesha Torah, they have to go through a conversion. They have to convert. There was a big battle until today, I think they have to apply to come live in Israel. But there was a battle as to whether to accept them or not. And certain rabbis said we should accept them. So you get those communities whose connection is far more tenuous and more difficult to prove, yet for whatever reason they want to join the Jewish people, even though we don't know
mm,
where their origins are from. You have people like the Lemba in South African area who have Jewish genetic material. But again, if we know like things like the Y chromosome, like of a Cohenim tend to three-quarters of them have a common genetic signature that shows they're related to each other and their origins are Middle Eastern and go back thousands of years. But if a Cohen moves to Africa, random like Joe Cohen, even 1,000 years ago, and settles there and marries a black African woman and has a couple of boys, all the male ancestry from that relationship will preserve the Jewish genetic connection on some level, albeit it'll be greatly diluted. So you have a number of groups of people living in primarily the southern part of Africa, who claim to also be descended from. And what's interesting now is, although their communities were not, their origins are in question, and they have to go through a lot of them conversion. Now they start to interact with Jews around the world. They start to take on more. They get Art Scroll Sidurim, and they get Judaica, and they have Talit. I've seen videos of these people. like Rudy Rockman, if you know who he is, he does these videos. He goes to Africa and he
Hmm.
goes to their synagogue, and they're all praying in the synagogue, and they're wearing kippot, and they're wearing taletzim, and they're doing,
Hmm.
and they have art scroll sidurim, and so these are also people whose origins are very tenuously connected to the Jewish people on some level, but there's even out in Papua New Guinea people who have connections. So it's really interesting. Another interesting group is the Samaritans in northern
Hmm.
Israel, who we know from the Christian Bible as the Good Samaritan story. By the way, in Jewish tradition, the Samaritans are never good. their, their tradition is they are the remnants of people who survived the exile, and they're the true Jews, and the real temple site is Mount Gerizim, which is by Shechem, Nablus of today.
Right.
And their origins are, and they have definitely Jewish genetic connection. They have a Samaritan Torah scroll, which has very significantly different from our Torah scroll. It's written in the Proto-Hebraic, more ancient script, by the way. There's only like 900 of them left. Uh, but the Jewish tradition about them is they are the remnants of the people that the Assyrians, when they exiled the northern kingdom, threw them into the northern part of Israel from somewhere else as their punishment. They got to live in northern Israel, and they tried, and the animals in the north were eating them, the lions and things, because the land didn't tolerate non-Jews living there. So they tried to insincerely convert, and the Jews of Judah rejected them, and they became all upset with us, and we've been battling it back and forth with them. But today there's all of 900 of them left, and their connection is very interesting, and there's a lot of debate about where they come from. And then you have groups like the Black Hebrews, who
Just a question. So the Samaritans today, do they want to be part of the Jewish people in terms of what we see as the more, I mean, it's hard to say who's Jewish people, like that normative community, or they're just, we don't even want to be part of that. We want to do our own thing.
no, they don't want to be. They consider themselves, even though there's like 900 of them left, they consider themselves to be the real authentic ones. The term used by them, Josephus talks about them. He's the Jewish historian going back almost 2,000 years. They're called Kutim, the Kutim. They're considered like a heretical offshoot group of people who are mentioned in the Bible who are not part of mainstream Judaism. So the mainstream conception of them, well, they live in Israel, and there's a lot of them, a lot of them Israeli citizenship, and also they have Palestinian papers too, I believe. But that's like a small group of people whose connection is really ancient, going back all the way back to the 10 lost tribe story, maybe. And they seem to have Jewish genetic connection. So it could be that they're today a mushmash of indigenous population, some Jewish, some
Right.
not, people brought in, we don't know. And then you get like the wildest stuff, and are like the Black Hebrews,
Mhm.
who are basically, like you have the Back to Africa movement you had that
Mhm.
began in America. Um, but these are people who again, going back to the 19th century, claimed that they were one of the lost tribes that were sold as slaves from Africa to America. And they started to, in the 1960s, reappear in places like Dimona in the south and the Negev. And it was a big battle with them too. And now I think it's like 2005, the government of Israel, they're not considered Jewish. Um, but they live in Israel. There's a whole big community of them in Dimona. They're given permanent residency status in the
Hmm.
land of Israel.
Wow.
Again, and they have subgroups. Like, it's amazing. Even when you become Jewish, you got to have a subgroup. You got to break
Of
away.
course.
And some of them are very radical, and some of them are claiming that they are the authentic Jews, and the Jews who claim they're Jewish today in Israel are all the fakers. They're white
Right.
supremacists who stole their identity, and it's really reverse racism and real negative attitude towards Jews in Israel.
Right.
But this is a group that has no, is not claiming, it's like a modern revivalist movement that no one
Right.
accepts
Meaning
them
they're
as
not saying
Jews.
they're one of the lost tribes. They're
And they're
not
not
claiming
undergoing
ancestry. Right.
yeah, they're not under, well, they are in their origins. They were saying maybe originally they ended up in America, but they ended up in Africa after the destruction, and but its origins begin very recently, mid 19th century in America. But these are people who are not trying to convert back. So, but they still
Right.
want some connection to us. So this is that wild story of so many different groups of people. Some of them go
Mhm.
back thousands of years, and the rest are a byproduct of various historical experiences that we've gone through. But like I said at the beginning of part one, that for everyone Jewish, there are a heck of a lot more non-Jews with Jewish ancestry floating around in this world.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Mashiach,
Fascinating.
Mashiach's going to have his work cut out for him trying to identify who's who. The only
Yeah.
problem is we said, Ellie, when Mashiach comes, you can't convert. So they'll have to, unless they can prove it, they're going to have to just settle for being Noahides.
Yeah. It's fascinating, like I teach conversion students here in Toronto, and it's fascinating. Every single story is so interesting in terms of why people want to reconnect or connect or come back, or whether they came from some kind of connection or whether they just feel at home there. So there's no question that um, any of these peoples who claim that they're part of the Jewish people or maybe part of the Jewish people, there's something drawing them towards something that they feel they love, that they feel at home with, that has a system and a people and a family and a history that they want to be connected to. So I tend to be an optimist and say that's not a bad thing. It's just how do we do it in a way where we can all kind of get on the same page and agree this is what
Sure.
we say Judaism is and how we be part of the people and do it in a compassionate um, and halachic way as best we can. It's a really interesting time in that way. There's definitely more people coming to the conversion process right now than there has been in the past for their own reasons. It used to be like 80%, 70% people were converting in order to get married. And
Right.
now the numbers are much more like 50-50. Like people are just coming of their own accord. They feel drawn to it. Um, and yeah, maybe because they're trying to get in under the wire before it happens that once we have Mashiach, you can't get in anymore. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, if we went back to what we said in part one about, the idea that converts are lost souls trying, reincarnated in a non-Jewish body and wanting to come home,
Mm.
that could explain the tremendous draw that so many peoples around the world whose maybe historical or even genetic connections are, you can't trace a soul unless you do past life
Right.
regression somehow. And that's, but that on the deepest spiritual, untraceable level, either historically or genealogically, you can't trace them back. But the soul wants to come home. So that's probably what you're saying. What we're seeing is this desire to A, come back to Judaism, and B, come back to Israel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. God willing. All of us soon. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi
Thank you.
Conspiro. Thank you, everyone, for listening. As always, please check the liner notes if you want to know how to get in touch, or if you want to recommend a topic, if you want to add anything to the conversation. Please rate, review, share, and let people know what we're doing. And hopefully, we'll be back soon. Thanks, everyone.